They said the bell rang long after midnight. Not once, not twice. Over and over, slow, deliberate, like someone calling the valley to wake. But when morning came, there was no one left to answer it. 3 of them at Harmon's Ford had accounts of the ringing. One said it was steady, not frantic, not irregular, but the measured pace of a bell being rung with purpose, one deliberate pull after another. One said it had a quality she could not quite name, a rhythm that was not the usual rhythm of a settlement bell, neither the single stroke of a death announcement nor the rapid peal of a fire call. A rhythm she had not heard before from that bell in the 2 years since the crossing had acquired it. The third said only that it continued for a long time, and that he had assumed, when he woke to it past midnight, that something was wrong at the crossing, and that he had told himself he would ride over in the morning to find out what. In the morning there was no one left at Callow's Crossing to explain it. The settlement itself had been established in 1841 by a group of families from the lower valley who had moved up into the creek bottom, seeking more land and more distance from the growing towns below. They had cleared the bottom, built their cabins, established the mill on the creek, and by 1844 had built the church. The bell had been brought up from the valley in the summer of 1846, a significant undertaking for 11 families in a creek-bottom settlement, and it had been rung for services and for emergencies and for nothing else in the 2 years since. Until the night of October 19th, 1848. Jonas Birch arrived at Callow's Crossing on the morning of October 20th, 1848, with a loaded wagon and no particular reason to expect anything unusual. He ran the supply circuit through the western ridge country every 3 to 4 weeks, the route that connected the valley town to the scattered settlements and farms on the upper drainage. And Callow's Crossing was his 3rd stop on the circuit, a regular stop, a settlement he had been supplying since 1844. He was 32 years old and had been working the circuit since he was 20. And in 12 years he had developed the specific literacy of a man who moved through a regular landscape and who knew its qualities well enough to notice immediately when one of those qualities had changed. He knew the ridge road in every season and every weather. He knew each settlement and farm on the circuit by name and by character and by what they looked and sounded like at different hours and in different conditions. He had the traveler's version of the same knowledge that a farmer had of his own land, not intimate in the way of daily occupation, but broad and consistent, the knowledge of repeated visits over many years. He knew the crossing the way a man knew a place he visited a dozen times a year. He knew what it looked like in every season. He knew the sound of it when the smithy fire was going and the mill was running and the settlement was at its ordinary work. He knew what it looked like in the morning, the specific quality of a small settlement coming into its day, the smoke from the chimneys, the movement of the animals, the first sounds of the people beginning their work. He knew what it was supposed to look like on the morning of October 20th, 1848. He knew immediately that it did not look like that. He came around the last bend in the creek road at 8:30 in the morning, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. No smoke. Not one chimney in the settlement showed smoke. It was a cold October morning, 40 degrees at most, the specific hard cold of a ridge morning in mid-October that put a visible breath on every exhaled word and that required a fire in any inhabited structure as a matter of basic comfort, not luxury. Every occupied cabin in the crossing would have had a fire going by 6 in the morning. He counted the chimneys from the road, the church, the smithy, the mill house, the 7 cabins visible at this angle. Not one of them was giving off smoke. He stopped the wagon. He sat on the board and looked at the settlement. He had been coming to Callow's Crossing for 4 years. He had come in every season, in every weather, at every point in the morning. He knew what the settlement looked and sounded like from this approach. The specific layered sound of a small community at work, the mill wheel if it was running, the hammer from the smithy if a fire was going, voices from the closer cabins, the sounds of animals being fed and moved through the morning's routines. He had been hearing this sound from this spot for 4 years. He heard nothing, not the ordinary silence of a place that was simply between sounds, the specific silence of a place that was not generating any. The horses were there, at the posts outside the smithy and the mill, and he could see them from the road. They were standing with the particular stillness of animals that had been tied in one position for too long, not the relaxed stance of horses who were resting between tasks, but the stiff, shifted weight stance of horses who had been standing since before dawn and whose bodies were telling them so. He sat with the reins in his hands for a full minute. He watched the settlement and listened to it and found nothing from either. Then he drove the wagon in. He went to the nearest cabin first, the alderman cabin, which sat at the road's left as you entered, which was where he always stopped first, because Thomas Alderman handled the settlement's collective orders, and because Thomas was usually the first person Jonas saw on his arrivals. He had a routine for arriving at Callow's Crossing. Alderman cabin, exchange the orders and the news, unload their portion of the supplies, then work through the settlement. He had done this routine perhaps 50 times. He called from the wagon. The habit of the circuit. "You called before you got down," announced yourself, gave people a moment to come to the door. No answer. He called again. Nothing from inside. Nothing from the yard. He sat on the board for a moment with the reins in his hands, looking at the alderman door. The door was open. Not ajar, open, swung fully inward on its hinges, the morning air moving in and out without impediment. He had never arrived at this door to find it standing open. The October air was cold, and you did not leave a door open in cold air unless you were coming back through it in the next minute. He got down and went to the door. The fire was cold, not just banked, cold, the specific gray-white ash of combustion that had been finished for many hours, the ash of a fire that had been allowed to go fully out rather than a fire that was being maintained. The fire had been burning when the family went to sleep. It had gone cold in the small hours. On the table, a pot, a bowl, a half-eaten piece of cornbread. He stood in the doorway and looked at the table and understood what he was seeing. Not a meal that had been set out and not yet started, not a meal cleaned up after. A meal interrupted. The cornbread with a bite taken from it, the bowl with food in it, the spoon lying across the bowl's edge in the specific position of a spoon set down in the middle of eating rather than after. 2 chairs pulled from the table. One pulled at an angle, not pulled back neatly the way you pulled a chair back when you were done and stood, but pushed to the side the way you pushed a chair when you stood quickly, and the chair moved with the motion of your legs. He stepped inside and stood in the middle of the room. The sound of his boots on the floor was very loud. He had been in this cabin perhaps 40 times. He knew where Thomas Alderman kept his tools and where his wife kept her sewing and which corner the children slept in. He knew what the room looked like occupied and what it looked like empty. It looked occupied. It had the quality of a room where someone had been recently, the warmth of a space that had been breathed in, the specific settled quality of a room that had been lived in last night. But the fire was cold, and the table was abandoned, and no one was there. He stood in the middle of the room and looked. He looked at the floor. Near the door, not in the corner where the boots were kept, not on the mat. A pair of boots. Placed on the open floor 3 feet from the threshold, placed the way you placed boots when you were going to put them on. Together, toes forward, set, down in a deliberate act of preparation. Beside the boots, on the floor, a lamp. Not the lamp from the table or the shelf. A lamp that had been carried. He knew the difference between a lamp set in its place and a lamp set down in the middle of carrying it. This lamp had been set down in the middle of carrying it, placed beside the boots, and the person who had been carrying it had not picked it up again. Someone had come to this door, had picked up a lamp for light, had come to the door, had set down the lamp, had not put on the boots, had not gone through the door. He looked at the boots for a long time. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the door, which was standing open in the October morning, and the specific empty yard beyond it. Then he went through the settlement. He went to each cabin in sequence, the way he covered any ground that needed to be covered, systematically without rushing, the specific thoroughness of a man who had decided he needed to know what he was dealing with before he decided what to do about it. The Finch cabin, fire cold, porridge congealed in the pot, 2 bedrolls left where they had been slept in, not made, just left. A child's single shoe under one of the bedrolls, its pair not visible anywhere in the cabin. The Webb cabin, fire cold, door open. A sewing project on the chair by the window, the needle still in the fabric. The work stopped mid-stitch. A cold cup of tea beside it. The Cord cabin, fire cold. The morning's water bucket full beside the hearth. Cold to the touch, sitting since before dawn. Someone had gone to the well in the dark, carried the water back, set it down, and then was not there anymore to use it. He went to the remaining cabins and found the same quality in each, the specific abandoned mid-action character of places where people had stopped being present without completing what they were doing. Not the abandonment of people who had packed and left, not the abandonment of people who had run in panic, just the stopping. The mid-gesture, mid-task, mid-morning stopping of 11 households. He stood in the last cabin with his hand on the door frame. 11 families. He counted them as he stood there. 45 people, roughly. He was not certain of every child's name, but he knew the households. 45 people who had been at their ordinary morning activities in the dark hours before dawn and who were not in the settlement now. He stood with his hand on the doorframe and did not move for a moment. Then he went to the church. The church sat at the settlement's north end, at the head of the small, cleared area that served as the crossing's common ground. It was a modest structure. 1 room, board and batten walls, a small bell tower at the front that had been added in 1846 when the congregation acquired the bell. Jonas had attended services here when his circuit timing allowed. He knew the church the way he knew the rest of the settlement, by repeated presence, by familiarity, by the accumulated knowledge of a place that had been part of his regular route for 4 years. He stood outside it for a moment before going in. The bell rope hung from the tower opening above, down through a hole in the ceiling of the main room and into the space below. It hung still in the October morning air. He stood at the open door and looked at it. He had rung a church bell before. He knew what the rope looked like when it was at rest after ordinary use, the specific hang of a rope that had been pulled once or twice and allowed to settle. He knew what it looked like after extended use. He went in. He took the rope in his hands and looked at the fibers at the grip position. Darkened, frayed, the specific wear of a rope that had been pulled hard and repeatedly over many hours. Not occasional use, sustained use. The kind of wear that the rope of a forge bellows got, or a mill mechanism. Something that had been operated continuously over a long period. He looked at the floor of the tower's base, scuffed. The specific back and forth pattern of feet in a confined space, moving in the rhythm of pulling a rope. A step forward with the pull, a step back with the release, again and again over a long time. The marks were deep enough in the dust to indicate extended duration, and the marks were not from a single pair of feet. He crouched and looked carefully at the overlapping impressions and found multiple sizes, multiple angles, the evidence of more than one person standing at that rope over the course of the night. More than one person had rung the bell. He stood and turned to the main room of the church. The pews were not square. He noticed this the way he noticed things that were slightly wrong in a familiar place. Not immediately, but within a moment of looking. The pews had always been square, the specific right-angle arrangement of a congregation that took care of its church, that straightened the pews after every service as a matter of habit and respect. 3 of the pews on the left side were angled toward the front, turned slightly from their positions, as though people had been sitting in them and had leaned or shifted toward the pulpit and had not straightened them when they stood. Recently, the dust on the floor beside those pews was disturbed. He looked at the pulpit. The Bible was open on it. He had attended services here. The Bible was closed at the end of every service. He had seen it closed, had seen the preacher close it deliberately as part of the closing. The Bible was open. He crossed to the pulpit and looked at the page it was open to without reading it. He looked at the front of the room for a moment. He turned to leave. The rope moved. He stopped. He stood with his back to the rope and held very still and listened to the silence of the church, the specific silence of a closed room in a settlement where no one was making any sound, and then turned around slowly. The rope was moving, not swinging, not the pendulum arc of a rope that had been pulled and released, a slow, slight displacement, the kind of movement a rope made when the bell far above it had been very gently disturbed. He watched the movement complete itself and the rope settle back to stillness. He stood in the middle of the empty church and looked at the still rope. No wind, the church had no windows open. The door behind him had not moved. He had not moved. He looked at the rope for a long time. Then he left the church, and he did not go back. He stood on the common ground outside, and he was very still for a moment. The settlement was around him, the cabins, the smithy, the mill, the road coming in from the east, and it was completely quiet. Not the quiet of early morning before people were up. Not the quiet of a place between its sounds. Something else. He had been in this settlement for nearly an hour, and the silence had not changed and had not been broken by anything except the sounds he himself had made. And now that he was standing still, those sounds had stopped too. He became aware, standing there, that his own footsteps had been very loud, that every door he had opened had been very loud, that in the quiet of Callow's Crossing on the morning of October 20th, 1848, his presence was the only sound, and that the silence around that sound had the quality not of absence but of attention. It was not the absence of sound that troubled him. It was the sense that something had stopped it. He walked to the animals, the horses at their posts, 4 of them, tied to the rails outside the smithy and the mill, standing with the specific discomfort of animals that had been tied too long. He untied them and opened the rail gate and moved them into the pasture where the crossing's cattle were standing. The horses would be fed by the grass. The cattle had their grass. The hogs were in their pen with water. The chickens were in the yard. He checked the smithy. The fire was cold, banked the same as the cabin fires, dead in the small hours. The tools were at their stations. The work in progress, a set of hinges in various stages of completion, was on the bench where it would have been left at the end of a working day. He checked the mill. The wheel was stopped at the correct position for overnight. The millstone still, the grain in the bin. The miller's records were on the shelf, the last entry dated October 19th. He stood in the mill in the silence of the empty settlement, and he thought about what he had found and what it meant. 45 people had been at Callow's Crossing on the evening of October 19th. The evidence was clear enough for that. Fires banked for the night, the pattern of the abandoned cabins consistent with people who had been asleep or in the early hours of their morning when something changed. The bell had been ringing from approximately 11 at night. The water bucket in the cord cabin was cold, fetched before dawn, before the cooking fire came up, before first light. Someone in that cabin had woken before dawn and gone to the well. He stood with the miller's ledger in his hand and looked at the last entry. October 19th. The mill had been operating the day before. Someone had been at this ledger yesterday. He set the ledger back on the shelf. He had been moving through occupied and unoccupied places for 12 years, since he first started the supply circuit as a young man of 20. He had seen settlements after fires, after floods, after the specific disasters that the ridge country produced. He knew what departure under pressure looked like, the disorder of things grabbed in urgency, the missing provisions and clothing and tools that people took when they were running. He knew what flight looked like. He had seen it. He had also seen, twice in 12 years, the aftermath of violence in an isolated community, the specific character of a place where something bad had happened and everyone knew it from the first step through the door. This was neither of those things. This was a settlement where no one had packed, no one had prepared, no one had taken anything, where the boots were beside the alderman door and the needle was in the web fabric and the water bucket was full in the cord cabin and the child's single shoe was under the Finch bedroll, where the animals were in their places and the tools were at their stations and the mill was stopped correctly for overnight and the smith's work was arranged on the bench for the next morning, where the only evidence of anything unusual was the bell, worn from hours of use, the rope frayed at the grip, the scuffed floor of the tower, the 3 angled pews, the rope moving in a still church. He could not make any of this fit any account he had. He had been trying to fit it since the alderman cabin, and he had not found an account that held it. He set down the things he had been holding, the miller's ledger back on the shelf, his own attention back from the place it had been going, and he walked to his wagon. He did not leave immediately. He stood at the wagon for several minutes, and he looked at the settlement. The October morning had continued to develop around it while he had been moving through it. The sun, higher now, the light fuller, the cold still present, but the specific edge of the earliest morning hours softened. In a normal morning at Callow's Crossing, this would have been the hour when the settlement was fully underway. Fires going strong, the mill running, the smithy fire lit, the day's work in its stride. The settlement was as quiet as it had been when he arrived. He thought about Thomas Alderman, who was always the first person he saw, who handled the collective orders with the specific efficiency of a man who had organized his community's logistics and taken the responsibility seriously. He thought about the Webb children, who had learned his arrival schedule and who sometimes ran to meet the wagon at the road. He thought about the Finch boy who had once spent 20 minutes examining the wagon's wheel mechanism and asking questions that Jonas had answered one by one, patient with the boy's curiosity. He thought about the boots by the alderman door, about whoever had lifted that lamp from its place, off a table, off a shelf, wherever it had been, and had carried it to the door and had set it down and had not crossed the threshold. About the specific moment that represented the decision to leave, the lamp lifted, the door almost reached, and then the stopping. He thought, they were here when the bell was ringing. He thought, they were here and the bell was ringing and something changed. He took the road east and he did not look back for a mile. He drove with his eyes on the road and his hands on the reins and his horses moving at the pace they set on a road they knew. He was aware of the settlement behind him, the way you were aware of something you were trying not to think about. As a presence at the back of attention, the specific quality of something left unresolved. After a mile, he stopped the wagon. He turned on the board and looked back. Callow's Crossing was still visible from here through the trees, the rooftops, the church tower at the north end rising above the canopy line. The arrangement he had been looking at for 4 years, the specific shape of a small settlement in a creek bottom, the shapes he had come around the bend to see 50 times. The bell did not ring. Nothing moved. He looked at the settlement for a long time from that distance. He looked at the church tower specifically. He looked at the roof lines of the cabins visible through the trees. He looked at the arrangement of the structures in the morning light and found it unchanged. Exactly the same shapes in exactly the same positions. The October light on them, the silence he could not hear from here but that he knew was there. He thought about the Bible open on the pulpit. He thought about whose hands had opened it to that page and left it there. He turned back to the road. He drove to Harmon's Ford and told them what he had found. He described it the way he had observed it. The cold fires, the abandoned meals, the boots and the lamp, the rope, the pews, the Bible, the rope moving in the still church. He described it in sequence and in plain language, and he did not add interpretation to any of it. He told them what he had seen. They listened without interrupting. When he was done, they were quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of people who had just been told something that they were taking in. Then they started asking questions he could not answer. He answered what he could. He could not answer most of it. He had been in that settlement for approximately 2 hours. He had looked at everything there was to look at, and he had found nothing that explained what he had seen. He had the account and no explanation for the account, and the account was what it was, and he did not add to it anything he did not know. He knew what he had found. He did not know what had been found. The investigation that followed was conducted by the county sheriff and by delegations from the neighboring settlements, and it found what Jonas had found: no tracks leaving the settlement. The ground in the creek bottom had been softened by rain 2 days before October 20th. The specific condition that made ground a reliable record of movement, soft enough to hold any impression clearly, but not so wet as to obliterate detail. The investigators walked the full perimeter of the settlement and examined the approach roads and the creek banks on both sides. No tracks led out of Callow's Crossing after the rain. No wagon had left. No horse had ridden out. No group of people had walked out in any direction. No bodies. They searched the surrounding terrain for 2 days. The hollow, the creek drainage above and below, the timber on both ridge sides. They found nothing. No evidence of violence anywhere in the settlement or outside it. The sheriff recorded in his report that he had never in 20 years of his position encountered a situation of this character, and that he had no account to offer. He recorded the physical evidence Jonas had described and which his own investigators confirmed: the cold fires, the abandoned meals, the boots by the alderman door, the full water bucket in the cord cabin. He recorded the bell rope, the frayed grip position consistent with hours of extended use, the scuffed floor, the multiple foot impressions. He recorded the open Bible on the pulpit, which the preacher, when notified of the disappearance and asked, confirmed had been closed and in its usual position when he locked the church the evening of October 19th. He recorded the angled pews. He wrote, "I have examined this settlement over 2 days with 6 men. I have found no explanation for the absence of 45 persons. I have found no evidence that they departed voluntarily or involuntarily in any direction I am able to examine. I have found evidence that they were present in the early morning hours of October 20th, the water bucket, the fire banking, the activity consistent with pre-dawn morning routine, and I have found evidence that they were present at the church at some point in the night, which the condition of the bell rope and the tower floor confirms. Beyond this, I cannot determine what occurred." He wrote, "The boots beside the alderman door are the most specific evidence I have. They are placed precisely as they would be placed by someone who had picked up a lamp and come to the door with the intention of going out and who had not gone out. They are not placed where boots were stored. They are placed where someone set them down in the middle of putting them on. This person did not leave through the door they were standing at." He wrote, "I do not know where they went instead. The settlement was not reoccupied. The structures stood empty through the years, the creek bottom reclaiming slowly what it had been before the families cleared it in 1841. The cabins weathered and the mill silted, and the smithy's roof came in the winter of 1852. The church stood longest, the way church structures stood longest, built with more care than the rest. The bell came down when the church roof finally failed in 1881. Who recovered it and what became of it is not in the record. The record has the same shape that the settlement had: a presence clearly documented, and then an absence clearly documented, and nothing in between that accounts for the transition from one to the other. 45 people and a settlement in full ordinary operation, and then nothing. No departure, no violence, no disaster, no footprints leaving, just the absence. And before the absence, the bell, ringing long past midnight, in a rhythm that the people at Harmon's Ford had never heard it ring before, and would never hear again. The bell rang long after midnight, over and over, slow, deliberate, like someone calling the valley to wake. By morning, there was no one left to hear it stop. The evidence remained exactly as it had been left. The boots by the alderman door, the lamp on the floor beside them, the rope worn and darkened from the night's work. The Bible lay open on the pulpit, and the valley that had been a settlement was simply a valley again, quiet in the way that places were quiet before anyone came to them. And after. If you listen closely, there are more stories like this waiting. Subscribe if you're curious, because some of these didn't happen just once. These are the stories from the edges of the recorded world,